This video will focus less on politics and history and more on the notorious serial killers who have plagued Central Europe since at least the 19th century. Few of these killers are known in the English-speaking world. This may change after watching this video. 10. Vienna domestic-made killer. Hugo Schenk was born in the multilingual Austrian Empire on February 11, 1849. As was common in the old Habsburg domination, Schenk was of German descent who grew up in the Czech-majority region of Moravia. Although the scion of a relatively prosperous family of middle-class origin, Schenk proved himself prone to crime at a very young age. Besides basic theft, the handsome Schenk became adept at conning women out of their money. Schenk, who was living in the imperial capital of Vienna, began telling the women that he was a Polish aristocrat named Wieniopolski. This trick fooled at least 4 women, almost all of whom worked as domestic servants. Schenk, along with his cruel friend Karl Schlosserek, tricked women into relationships or marriages and later raped and murdered them. Schenk's modus operandi was simple but brutal. After raping and killing his victims, Schenk would tie rocks to their bodies and throw them into the Danube River. The reason for each murder was clear: Schenk stole every penny his victims owned. Schenk was a meticulous conman, and when he was finally caught, police officers in Vienna discovered that Schenk had been communicating via letters to at least 50 potential victims. Schenk was hanged in 1884. His skull is still preserved in the Vienna Crime Museum. 9. Martvo Monster. The 1950s were a turbulent period in Hungarian history. In 1956, thousands of Hungarians took to the streets after Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev publicly condemned the repressive policies of the Stalinist era. Believing that a new era of political freedom had begun in Central Europe, Communist Prime Minister Imre Nagy moved to establish a multi-party system. Moscow denounced the move, and on November 1, 1956, the Soviet Red Army invaded Hungary and re-established a doctrinaire communist state, one that allowed greater local autonomy. Given such major events, ordinary Hungarians could be forgiven for not noticing that a serial killer began strangling women in 1957. Peter Kovacs, later known as the Martvo Monster, killed 5 women over a period of 10 years. The first victim, Margit Szegedy, was found dead by police on July 22, 1957. The killer remained quiet until 1963, when he began strangling women again in the small village of Martvo. When Kovacs was arrested in 1967, it turned out that he was working as a truck driver and living outside Martvo. Kovacs was a typical lust killer who stalked his victims after being sexually aroused by their appearance. After seeing his first victim leave her job at a shoe factory, Kovacs chased her on a bicycle and then hit her in the back of the head with a sharp object. Kovacs' other victims were similarly abused before their deaths. On December 1, 1968, Kovacs was executed by hanging by the Szolnok District Court. His arrest not only led to the release of János Kerják, who spent 11 years in prison for the murder of Margit Szegedy, but also highlighted the weaknesses of the Hungarian Communist Party, which refused to believe that serial killers existed in socialist countries. 8. Volker Eckert. By his own admission, German truck driver Volker Eckert thought a lot about killing before he finally committed his first murder. Eckert was born on July 1, 1959 in communist East Germany, and committed his first murder in 1974 when he was just 15 years old. The victim attended the same school as Eckert and was a year younger. Eckert strangled the girl and made her death look like a suicide. The adults of the town of Plauen had swallowed this trick for decades. All of Eckert's subsequent murders fit a pattern: he strangled prostitutes to death in different countries. Many of Eckert's victims were drug addicts, illegal immigrants, or simply ignored women. What helped Eckert's case was the fact that police in various European countries did not often interact with each other during the height of his killing spree, mid-1990s to early 2000s. Unfortunately, Eckert was well known to police officials in East Germany. Between 1988 and 1994, he served a 12-year prison sentence for raping and assaulting an unknown woman. When he got out of prison, Eckert got a job as a truck driver, which allowed him to visit European countries as diverse as Italy, France, Switzerland, and Spain for work. Between 2001 and 2006, Eckert supposedly killed 5 prostitutes, a Kenyan immigrant in France, a 24-year-old Spanish prostitute, a Russian immigrant in Catalonia, a 28-year-old Polish immigrant in Reims, and a 20-year-old pregnant woman. An old Bulgarian woman lives in Spain. Eckert is suspected of killing 7 more prostitutes between 1987 and 2004. Eckert was finally arrested in 2006 after a surveillance camera captured images of his truck at the scene of the last murder. When police seized Eckert's truck near Cologne, they discovered graphic photographs of Eckert's victims, some of which showed him torturing the unfortunate women. Eckert escaped justice again in 2007, when he managed to commit suicide inside his cell in Bayreuth. 7. Krakow Vampire. Unlike Warsaw, which burned to the ground during World War II, Krakow still has all the medieval charm one would expect to find in southern Poland. In this city on December 18, 1946, Karol Kot was born. Like many later serial killers, young Karol showed signs of distressing illness. One of his favorite pastimes was torturing small animals. Karol's penchant for mutilating animals would follow him throughout his teenage years. Kot proved to be an untrustworthy student, and while at university he had a nervous breakdown. Kot eventually attended technical college, where he joined the archery team. Shortly after enrolling at his new school, Kot committed his first attack in September 1964. During a church service, Karol stabbed an elderly woman in the back as she knelt in prayer. The woman managed to survive. 77-year-old Marie Plesty was not so lucky. On September 29, 1964, Kot stabbed the elderly woman to death on Jan Street in Krakow. His next victim, 11-year-old Leska Kalka, was found stabbed to death on February 13, 1966. In April of the same year, Kot attempted to kill an 8-year-old girl, but the girl survived despite being stabbed for 8 years. Times. Kot was arrested in June 1966 after an associate told the police about Kot's activities. Kot's case remained in the Polish legal system until November 1967, when Kot was sentenced to life imprisonment. This was changed to death in 1968, and Kot was executed by hanging in May of that year. He was only 21 years old. 6. Nurse test. 30-year-old nurse Peter Zelenka thought his job was to test the doctors working at the hospital where he worked. Unfortunately, Zelenka's tests often led to the death of patients. Between May and September 2006, 7 patients died suddenly in the intensive care unit in the Czech city of Havlíčkův Brod. None of the victims were considered particularly terminal cases and, in fact, all were expected to live. Zelenka, the man responsible for the 7 deaths, was arrested in December 2006 by Czech police officers. Investigators discovered that Zelenka had given the victims the blood thinner heparin without their knowledge. Zelenka would administer the drug via a secret vial, and he would do so in such large doses that most of the victims died of internal bleeding. Zelenka later admitted to trying to kill 3 other patients, but each attempt ended in failure. Shockingly, Zelenka worked at the hospital for 7 years before the murder and had several run-ins with hospital authorities. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in February 2008. 5. Midday Killer. German serial killer Klaus Gussmann had a unique habit: he shot his victims when the noon bells rang in his hometown. Born in Frankfurt in 1940, Gussmann was a resident of the Bavarian town of Hersbruck when he began killing people randomly. There is no doubt that a large part of Gussmann's psyche came from his father, a former Wehrmacht soldier who loved to tell his son stories about killing American soldiers during World War II. At just 19 years old, Gussmann shot two strangers, Ernst Herring and his girlfriend Valeska Eder. When the church bells rang at midday in Hersbruck, Gussmann knocked on the door of the couple's apartment, and when they answered, he killed them. No one heard anything. 2 years later, Gussmann struck again, this time killing bank manager Erich Haubauer and stealing 3,000 marks from the Deutsche Bank in Ochenbruch. Gussmann would kill another bank worker, this time a porter, that same year. Gussmann continued to kill between 1963 and 1966. During that period, a gun shop owner, her son, and a businessman were killed in Nuremberg. When Bavarian police arrested him, they found that one of his rifles had the name Elke engraved on the handle. Gussmann admitted that this was in reference to the German actress Elke Sommer, whom Gussmann planned to kidnap and kill. The cold-blooded Gussmann was once quoted as saying, "People to me are nothing more than inanimate objects. I am a pragmatist." 4. Carnival Killer. Jürgen Bartsch was born with a lot of bad luck. An illegitimate child whose mother died of tuberculosis shortly after his birth, Bartsch grew up in the care of nurses. When he was just under a year old, Jürgen was adopted by a butcher living in the town of Langenberg in the Rhineland. Unfortunately, the butcher's wife suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder, and forbade Jürgen from playing with other children for fear that he would become dirty and sick. An abused and damaged young man, Jürgen was further traumatized when his parents pulled him from his beloved school and forced him to attend a strict Catholic school where he disciplined along military lines. Between 1962 and 1966, Bartsch killed 4 more boys, and later told police he had tried or at least planned to kill hundreds more. In most cases, Bartsch would lure his victims to an empty air raid shelter located on Heger Street and then beat them mercilessly. What Bartsch did next was out of the ordinary. He would tie up his victims, fondle their genitals, masturbate, strangle or stab the victims to death, and then dismember their bodies in order to empty their stomach and chest cavities. Bartsch was only arrested in 1966 after one of his victims, 15-year-old Peter Fries, managed to escape an air raid shelter thanks to a candle Jürgen left behind at the scene. In December 1967, Bartsch confessed to his crimes and was sentenced to 10 years juvenile imprisonment. He died 9 years later in April 1976 after a botched castration. He was given a lot of anesthesia. 3. Sex offenders. There is no sex offender and serial killer more disgraced in the sleepy country of Switzerland than Erich Hort. Hort's name became infamous on October 30, 1993, when police in Zurich found the body of 20-year-old scout leader Pasquale Broman. Broman's body left no doubt about how she died. She had been stabbed in the neck by an unknown hand. On November 1, 1993, police arrested Hort for Broman's murder. Police know Hort's name well, as the ex-con has 11 previous convictions for rape and 2 murders. In 1982, Hort raped and killed a 26-year-old man when he found him running near Lake Zurich. A year later, Hort was killed again. The victim this time was a 72-year-old woman. Hort confessed to these crimes and was originally sentenced to life imprisonment. However, as time passed, his sentence was reduced. Broman died because of a prison program that allowed Hort to take unaccompanied leave for a certain period of time. It was Hort's case, along with the rape of a 13-year-old girl in 1996, that is often cited as the reason why Swiss voters in 2004 chose to support mandatory life sentences for serious sex offenders. As for Hort himself, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for a second time in 1996. Broman's mother has filed a lawsuit against the canton of Zurich over their lax treatment of serial sex offenders. 2. Death Guard. Roger Andermatt, a seemingly ordinary nurse from Lucerne, is the most prolific serial killer in Swiss history. On January 29, 2005, Andermatt, known as the Death Guard of Lucerne, was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murders of 22 of his patients. Most of Andermatt's victims were residents of nursing homes and were between 66 and 95 years old. Andermatt usually carried out his crimes by first injecting his victims with lethal doses of tranquilizers. Then we use plastic bags to suffocate them to death. When Andermatt wasn't working with elderly patients in nursing homes, he was a dance teacher and worked as a DJ under the name ROG. Andermatt and his defense team have already tried to convince a Swiss jury that the 36-year-old nurse killed his victims out of sympathy. Specifically, Andermatt claimed that he no longer wanted to see elderly patients suffer, and came up with the idea of killing them as an act of charity. Although initially tried for the murders of 22 people, Andermatt actually confessed to 27 murders in total. Ironically, euthanasia is legal in all the Swiss cantons where Andermatt was killed, but Andermatt failed to follow the country's strict compliance regulations. 1. Cannibals roar. Joachim Kroll can be seen as Germany's Jeffrey Dahmer, except Kroll killed 14 people before anyone knew who Dahmer was. Kroll was born in Silesia in what is now known as the Polish city of Zabrze, and grew up as the sixth child in a family of 9. Kroll's father was a coal miner who ended up as a prisoner of war during World War II. During that time period, Kroll's family moved west to the region of North Rhine-Westphalia. Kroll's reign of terror began in 1955. His first victim was 19-year-old Irmgard Strell, whom Kroll raped, stabbed, and mutilated. Kroll's other victims included 15-year-old Manuel Nutt, whom Kroll murdered, raped and cannibalized in July 1959, 13-year-old Petra Gez, who died around Easter 1962, and 20-year-old Ursula Rohling in September 1966. Kroll was able to escape this bloodshed thanks to shoddy police work. Other men were charged and convicted of Kroll's crimes, including Vinzenz Gwyn, who was convicted of Gize's murder. Walter Quaker was the prime suspect in the murder of 13-year-old Monika Tavel and eventually committed suicide. Adolf Schickel, Rohling's friend, was suspected of killing her and himself. For 21 years, Kroll murdered, mutilated and cannibalized victims along Germany's Ruhr Valley. His luck ran out in July 1976, when Kroll casually told a neighbor that the toilet they shared was clogged with intestines. When the neighbor told police about the 43-year-old's strange confession, investigators arrived at Kroll's apartment and found liver, lungs, kidneys and a heart cooking on Kroll's stove. Police discovered that the body parts came from a 4-year-old girl. That girl was none other than a missing child named Marion Keeter. At his trial, Kroll admitted to killing 14 people. As for why he practices cannibalism, Kroll said that eating human flesh reduces his monthly grocery bill. Kroll was sentenced to life imprisonment and died there of a heart attack in 1991. At the end of the video, leave us your comment on the stories that left the most impact on you, and don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell to receive our new video.